AI taking over, being able to replace humans. I need your thoughts on this.
This is cultural evolution. Evolution is a search algorithm, and it's one of the least efficient search algorithms ever created. You figure out how to do these things well, and you survive. You don't figure out how to do it well, and you don't.
Benjamin Kuipers, MIT PhD.
His research is in artificial intelligence and robotics, currently investigating ethics as a foundational domain of knowledge for AIs that may act as members of human society.
Do you see the proliferation of AI too soon being problematic?
It's a tool. We might use it for good, we might use it for ill. The world has largely already been taken over by artificially intelligent creatures, which are corporations. The role of a corporation is to maximize its profits. Cooperation and trust is critical. Ethics helps create cooperation, and cooperation is what gives us positive sum returns. Have courage about your ability to change things for the better.
Professor Kuipers, thank you so much for sitting down with me to do this.
Absolutely.
It's a pleasure. There's few people who I found who bring to this conversation both the philosophical mind and the prowess of having the technical and background in AI. So I'm super excited to dive in with you. I figured we would start by just having you give a little bit of your background and what your background is in and what you're working on now.
Okay. One way of starting this is way back. So when I was a kid, I would take these long walks with my dad, and we would walk around and look at the stars and things like this. Now, he worked as an engineer. He'd been really trained in mathematics and loved mathematics, and so did I. And we would just talk about science and space and all of this stuff. And one of the things we talked about was, wouldn't it be cool to have a science of the mind and to be able to have the kind of mathematics that you want in order to talk about the mind? And so now I was in junior high and high school, and I was thinking, boy, I can't wait to get to college so I can take a psychology course. But because way back then, they didn't have high school psychology courses.
When is way back then?
That's probably the 60s,
okay.
50s, maybe even.
There was no psychology in high schools?
Not in the high schools I was going to.
Right.
So I got to college, and I took a psychology course. And it was this crashing disappointment because the interesting things, and there were plenty of interesting things, but the interesting things weren't rigorous, and the rigorous things weren't interesting. So I figured, okay, well, I had guessed wrong about psychology, but I loved math, and so I'd be a math major. So then I went and was a pure math major, and I'd really kind of drunk the mathematics Kool-Aid. I don't know if you've ever seen a book by G.H. Hardy called A Mathematician's Apology, which really kind of captures the way mathematicians look at the world. And so turned out I was going to go to MIT for graduate school. And
Impressive.
So that was fun. And when I got to graduate school, just on a lark, I took some computer science courses. And one of the courses there was Marvin Minsky's.
What do you mean on a lark? Like it wasn't a popular thing at the time to take a computer science course?
Well, I was supposed to be studying pure math, and I had a whole bunch of pure math things in my agenda that I was going to be doing. Now, I had taken a couple of years off between undergraduate and graduate school. And that was partly because this was during the Vietnam War, and I had been a conscientious objector. And so I got drafted.
Wow.
So I was, and when you have conscientious objector status, then you need to spend 2 years doing something that is of social benefit.
This is an official plaque, a conscientious objector?
It was a status with the Selective Service.
Oh, interesting.
Back then, you had a status, and you would either have a deferment or something, or you would be drafted.
Wow.
And as a conscientious objector, I might be drafted and sent to a mental hospital to carry bedpans or something like this.
I see. Okay.
Now, once it was clear that I had a low draft number, you can look up draft lotteries at that time. So it was clear I was going to be drafted. I figured, just like anybody going into the military or into national service, I certainly had the right to arrange things in a way that I thought I could do the best service and it would be interesting. So I ended up getting a job programming computers in the psychology department at Harvard.
Wow.
Not exactly a major hardship.
No, not exactly the military either. You were drafted to this, or you found this role?
Well, it was clear that I was going to be called up to do my national service. Because I was a conscientious objector, then my national service would not be to go into the military. They would find a role for me if I left that up to them. But if I were able to say, here's a role that I think would meet these needs. And so I found myself going to Harvard and programming in the psychology department. And that met their needs, so I did that. So after I finished that, I went to MIT. But I'd had a taste of programming computers for a couple of years, and I'd have a taste of psychology. Both of those were quite interesting, but I was aiming for this pure math goal, and so I decided one of the courses each semester was going to be a computing course, some sort of thing. And so I took this graduate introduction to artificial intelligence that was taught by Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert. And the skies opened, and I realized that this is what I had always wanted. The computational methods were a kind of mathematics that was useful for describing the phenomena of mind. And so I realized this is the kind of mathematics I wanted to do, I had wanted to do all along. So I went and started hanging around in the AI lab at MIT.
There was already an AI lab.
There was already an AI lab that Minsky
like
and Papert had created.
The mid-late 70s, or?
This was in the mid-70s.
Mid-70s.
So this was all happening about 1972.
Wow.
So I graduated from college in 70 and then did alternative service from 70 to 72.
You didn't hear about AI during any of that time?
Well, in our conversations with my dad, he had mentioned that there was this interesting stuff. People were building little turtle robots and doing things like this.
Okay.
And so we'd had little bits of conversation, and I had probably read some articles in Scientific American or someplace like this.
Right.
But when I started going to MIT, I started hanging around in the AI lab. And it was so fascinating. There were people talking about all kinds of aspects of mind. And a lot of it was cognition, problem solving, planning, natural language understanding. But some of it was computer vision. Some of it was robot motion. But I decided what I really liked was Minsky's approach to this, which was looking at common sense knowledge. And he was just developing a new idea called frames, which was looking at large descriptions of interesting things in the world. And I had written a chapter and started drafting notions about this idea of frames. And I got a summer internship to spend at the Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox PARC in Palo Alto. And so I went there for, I think this was probably the summer of 73. Wow. And that was a very exciting time in Palo Alto. So
it's incredible. What was the energy like in Palo Alto at that time?
Oh, it was amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, at PARC, they were developing some of the very first personal computers. So they had the Alto there, which was a personal computer that could fit under a desk. Amazing. And it had this desktop metaphor. You've probably read the stuff about Steve Jobs' early tour when Park gave him a tour of their
Yes.
metaphor. And he said, "Ooh, what a good idea."
You also had a tour?
I had a tour. Well, I spent the summer there,
You spent
which
the
was
summer.
exciting. So, and in the course of that, I sort of explained to Danny Bobrow, who was the head of the lab that I was in, I was interested in common sense knowledge.
Right.
And he said, and I wondered, how should I focus this? Because so far, this is such a big area, such a big problem. And he said, well, he had a friend back in Boston who had been working on cognitive maps. And I thought, wow, this is the issue of traveling around in a large environment like a city or a building or something like this, where you have to kind of knit together your local observations in order to kind of build a map that will help you understand the structure of that environment. And I thought, wow, that was great. And I read the articles by this friend of his, and I said, well, we can go a lot farther than that. And so that ended up being my PhD thesis.
Wow. And this was common sense and cognitive maps?
Cognitive maps,
Cognitive
specifically.
maps.
And so my PhD was called The Representation of Knowledge of Large-Scale Space. And among other things, there were a lot of people who thought of cognitive maps as being a lot like printed maps. You would have an image in your head that you would place locations on. And so you would look at it with the mind's eye and that you would plan. Now, you start thinking about this and you realize it can't be like that.
Right.
It can be in part, but there's a lot of things going on in people's common sense knowledge of large-scale space that aren't expressible in terms of a printed map, because a printed map basically has a single metrical frame of reference. And if you put, say, two places in that, then they have a certain relationship in that frame of reference. And if you put a third place in, then it automatically inherits a set of relations with these other places. And a fourth, it inherits relationships with all these others. People's knowledge doesn't work that way. You learn a place, you may learn how to get to another place, you may go from there to a third place, and you may have no idea what the relationship between the first and the third are.
Interesting.
They can be almost anywhere. Their orientations can be different. If you think about, say, driving around country roads, particularly in the mountains behind west of Palo Alto, then they sort of wind around. You don't know where you are with respect to some of these other places. Some people do, some people don't. And so there's a lot of individual variation. There's a lot of incomplete knowledge. Part of common sense knowledge is to be able to reason effectively with incomplete knowledge. Our knowledge is always incomplete, but we reason with it. We reason in ways that are often really quite effective. How can we possibly do that?
We'll get into it in a minute, but then I'm sure that reasoning gets into trouble when we have AI now that hallucinates, right? It reasons and then has a wrong reasoning.
You don't hallucinate?
I do, but I don't.
So there you go.
But I often will come in it when I am reasoning off information I believe to be unreliable. I'll say, I don't really know if this is right, or I'll add that caveat in.
That's right.
That perhaps AI doesn't always add in.
And how many people have you talked to who will kind of riff off some starting point and will be absolutely certain, or so they say, about the conclusions they're drawing, and they don't actually qualify their conclusions?
Many.
So this is not a completely unknown phenomenon.
Right.
Now, it is a phenomenon that we learn to cope with. And you listen to somebody, and after a while you say, well, that person has a strong tendency to bullshit.
Right.
So let me take that into account when I consider how trustworthy I want to consider them.
Yes.
Now, that's not an issue that I started trying to formalize until much, much later.
Right. And that gets into that then gets into your work on trust and cooperation and so on.
Yeah.
So at that point, when you did this PhD, you were at MIT at that
Yeah.
point in time. And so what was the culture of AI like at that point in time? Like what was were there companies building AI yet? Was this
No.
strictly academic?
It was almost entirely academic,
Wow.
although some of the work was going on at companies like Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, which was elsewhere in Cambridge, and SRI, which was originally the Stanford Research Institute in Palo Alto, but it had spun off of Stanford in order to do certain kinds of things. When Xerox created the Palo Alto Research Center, they were interested in AI, and they had several very good AI people working there. But it certainly didn't have the AI startup culture. The startup culture in Palo Alto had been inspired by things like Hewlett-Packard and Intel and things like that. So much more sort of hardware. And when Apple got started sometime a little bit later, that was also a very exciting time. But during my summer in Palo Alto, I went to the Homebrew Computing Club.
And so if that was what the culture was like, and then even at MIT, you began teaching shortly thereafter, right? After that PhD. So when you were teaching, what did you start off teaching at that time?
Oh, well, let me feed in another bit of this development.
Sure.
So I did my PhD and had a model of how a simulated robot could explore an environment and build a cognitive map.
Okay.
And had multiple representations for knowledge. Now, there were some people at DARPA who paid attention to this, and they thought it was pretty cool. And they were also paying attention to an interesting guy who was a cognitive psychologist named Al Stevens, who they recruited from UC San Diego to come to BBN, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. And so a program officer at DARPA came to us and said, would you be interested in a research grant? So we said, sure. So this was my 1 year of DoD-funded research.
Okay.
And so it basically supported a postdoc year. And so I stayed at MIT at a different institute within MIT. And Al was at BBN, and we collaborated some, and we did independent research and some. We got to the end of that year, and I started looking around for places that would support the kind of research I wanted to do. And the main agency that was interested was another DoD agency that wanted to build cruise missiles that could follow cognitive maps and go to somebody's house and blow it up. So I said, is this what I want my life's research, my life's work to be dedicated to?
Sure.
Now, I had been a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War, so this was not
not in line with the values.
that was lined up with my values.
No.
So I said, nope. Now, meanwhile, one of my friends at MIT, a faculty member named Peter Solovitz, was running an AI and medicine lab, and he had been trying to recruit me.
Okay.
So I go over to him and I say, Peter, sign me up.
Okay.
So I figured, okay, can't seem to find funding for the cognitive map work. I'll sort of switch gears and do some work in AI and medicine. I started collaborating with various people there, but particularly with a physician named Jerry Kassirer. And he was a very renowned nephrologist, and we were interested in studying how expert physicians think about the physiological mechanisms of the body. And so I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to think about causal reasoning, because that seems to be another kind of common sense knowledge.
Right.
And in the course, we did some studies that involved posing a difficult problem and then recording interviews and transcribing them and then doing sort of word-by-word analysis of the stuff they were explaining. And what came out of that was a quite different, not so causal, way of looking at reasoning about these physiological systems. It would say things like, if you eat a potato chip, then you're taking in some salt, which is increasing the salinity of your bloodstream, which then increases the salinity of other bodies of fluid inside your body, and it starts moving some of the fluid from here to there, and it'll increase your blood pressure. Increased blood pressure will also increase things like how hard the muscles in your heart have to work, right, and so on and so on. And so looking at that and thinking about how you could do that kind of reasoning and what kinds of objects and relations you had to think about led to a whole area called qualitative simulation and qualitative reasoning. And there were several other people looking at this from slightly different directions, but I developed a simulation method, a representation and a simulation method that was really great, if I do say so myself. One of my friends there, Ken Forbes, developed a way to build interesting models out of libraries of model fragments. Okay. A guy named Johan de Cleer had kind of started this qualitative view of the world. And he actually ended up going to Xerox PARC and has spent his career there.
Wow.
So that was another area that ended up being quite influential.
And that work you were doing within the space of medicine?
Yeah.
So qualitative
reasoning, but also qualitative simulation.
Qualitative simulation. You were using that and applying that to medicine.
Yes.
And very interesting.
Yes.
And you did that for them. And so the medicine makes sense. Like around that point, you chose the fork in the road that was more ethical. And you, of course, early on were that way as well. But what eventually got you to be really interested in the ethics of AI?
Okay, that goes a fair ways down the way. So stepping back a little bit, I decided I wasn't going to take this military funding.
Right.
I was going to do the stuff in AI and medicine. And so I needed a job. And I took a teaching job at Tufts University. Okay. Which was the same place where at the medical school I had this collaborator, and I was nearby to MIT and could talk to people there. And so I started teaching calculus. That's what you do when you're in a math department at Tufts. I was teaching calculus. That was actually fitting in intellectually with some of these ideas about simulation. They were sort of growing a computer science department in the math department at Tufts. And so I was helping with that, and I taught AI courses and other computer science courses. Then, in the course of things, I started bringing in grant money, started publishing papers, getting well-known, having some impact out there. And Tufts turned me down for tenure. Dang. Never saw that one coming. Yeah. Now, it turns out as in math, there were specialists there in the qualitative theory of differential equations. Okay. And I was developing qualitative simulation, which I also called qualitative differential equations. But these two things, even though their names were very, very similar, were quite different. If you think about a numerical simulation, the way that works is you have a state of the world that you describe in terms of some precise numbers. Sure. And then you have an algorithm that gives you the next state, and the next state, and the next state, and the next state. And it predicts a linear sequence of states. And you look at it and you draw whatever conclusion you're going to draw. If your knowledge is incomplete and qualitative, sometimes you can uniquely specify the next state, but sometimes you can't. And so what the qualitative simulator does is it branches. And it says, well, there's two possible futures. Actually, often there's a third, which is the boundary between those two. And so you get this branching tree of possible futures.
Sure.
Heard of the multiverse? But this was something that I came up with as I was thinking about about simulating the future with incomplete knowledge and this branching tree of possible futures. And what was particularly cool, I was able to prove a theorem that said the prediction is sound. That is, it will always include all of the possibilities, but it is incomplete. That is, it's not always able to eliminate things that aren't possible. So some of the things in this branching tree won't be possible, but they'll still be there, and your problem is to have to eliminate them. But if something you're concerned about isn't in the tree, then it really isn't possible. So there's some useful things you can predict there. So this was another piece of the puzzle. Getting turned down for tenure turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to me professionally in my life. Because Tufts was kind of a local optimum, but in fact, they didn't have a doctoral program. I ended up looking for other possibilities. I had grant money, so I was able to give myself a sabbatical at MIT for a year while they worked out their process. I applied to a bunch of places, and then I went to the University of Texas at Austin with tenure.
Okay.
And I got doctoral students. And doctoral students are the greatest thing. And so with them, I was able to work on a whole bunch of interesting projects, most of them in this qualitative simulation area. And we developed something called QSIM for the qualitative simulator. But I also got restarted on some of the cognitive map work. And so we started implementing those first on simulated robots and then on physical robots. And that was very, very successful.
This all still, so this was in building to the question of how did you get into ethics?
Right. So I started poking around in various directions and went on to be thinking about computer vision and objects and actions and so forth. But all of this is really saying, I'm going to treat the world as though there's one learning agent. And I'm thinking of this like a baby. And the baby doesn't really think of other things in the world as being agents, people who think things and do things for reasons. Everything out there is just something to be understood. But I knew all along that when I wanted to sort of map out the domains of common sense knowledge, that there was another whole branch of social common sense knowledge.
Can we pause there and define common sense knowledge?
Okay. Common sense, different experts think of common sense in very different ways. And somewhat more famous than me by a good shot are people like John McCarthy and Doug Lennett. And John McCarthy thought of common sense knowledge as being certain kinds of non-standard logic, being able to reason about non-monotonic logic, which I could explain, but I don't think I will for this purpose. Doug Lennett felt that common sense knowledge was the sort of encyclopedic knowledge you have about everything in the world that you can draw on when you then have a particular problem to solve. My view of common sense knowledge is that there are certain foundational domains, and space is sort of the first one, that particularly navigational space, but manipulation space is another, and auditory space, local visual space is another. But also domains like the domain of objects and actions. These are foundational domains that an agent becomes an expert in. And this is the foundation on which all other kinds of knowledge are built. Now, some of the foundations, and the ones I concentrated on, were essentially egocentric for an individual agent that's trying to understand the world around it. But pretty quickly, there's a social component that says there's other people. And theory of mind is one branch in there. I'm not the only one with beliefs, perceptions, goals, plans. You have beliefs too. Amazing.
Goals and plans too.
And goals and plans. And they might be different from mine. So when you study young children early on, they don't understand the difference between beliefs in different heads. They assume that everyone has the same knowledge. Everyone thinks the same thing. But at a certain point, they learn. And you can create experiments that demonstrate this and that change at certain ages. It's fascinating.
But the common sense is somewhat shared by a society, right?
Yeah. So one of the many domains of common sense knowledge is theory of mind. Another aspect is learning from imitation. And another aspect is ethics.
Okay.
So finally we get to ethics.
Finally we get to ethics.
and so I was thinking, I've spent a lot of time on common sense about the physical world. Let's go start dealing with the social world. And within that, the ethics was a really, really attractive part. And that started maybe 10 years ago.
10 years ago?
Yeah.
Wow. So 10 years ago, you decided to jump into almost something completely different. It's not completely different, but maybe a branch of a different tree.
This is the great thing about the academic life. See, I tell people that the life of a faculty member at a major research university is the single finest lifestyle that this entire society provides. So, because you have more autonomy than anybody, even people in your situation. And I get to work with a bunch of students. I get to work on whatever I think is the most important problem. And if as that evolves over a lifetime, I can change. Right. So I started as a pure mathematician, and I decided I had to build robots. And so I started building robots.
But they had to be ethical.
Later on, I decided that ethics was an important kind of common sense knowledge. Earlier on, I was thinking, I have to be ethical. But I hadn't sort of grappled with that as a kind of common sense. It was clear that ethical behavior was very important. And for example, making the decision to apply for conscientious objector status was a very important part of my own personal development. Right. 9/11 was a very important time. And that was a point when, it's clear we have, just like Pearl Harbor. I wasn't alive then, believe it or not. But 9/11 comes along. We have genuine enemies. What is the right way to respond to them? Now, at that time, I felt this is actually my decision as a human. And so it's significantly later that I start saying the fact that people have to think ethically is also a part of common sense knowledge that if we're going to build intelligent agents, AIs and robots, then they're going to have to think ethically as well. And so part of the question is, what is ethics? Now, of course, there are philosophers who've been working on this for 2,500 years. They've had a lot of thoughts about that. But I think we also bring other things to the table. And so we have other ideas that are helpful in order to elucidate what ethics is all about, how people are ethical, what does ethics do for us as members of a society, gets into some of these issues about social evolution.
Yes. So social evolution gets very exciting, and definitely is part of the conversation we want to have today.
Yeah.
AI's impact on cultural evolution. So let's start by getting into that a little bit. What is cultural evolution in your mind? And slowly, what is the AI impact on evolution that is front of mind right now?
When I tried to figure out what is ethics, see, I see AI as being applied mathematics for the purpose of understanding the mind. Ethics is part of the mind, so I want to use AI methods to understand ethics.
AI methods or mathematic methods? Or are they one and the same?
They're one and the
One
same.
and the same.
I mean, I actually seriously believe that AI should be considered applied mathematics for the purpose of formulating descriptions of the mind.
Interesting.
And that can be used scientifically to say, how is the mind actually structured in humans? It can be used from an engineering point of view, saying, how can we build things that can do intelligent stuff? But fundamentally, what we in AI do is we build formal methods for describing things. The early methods when I came in were things that were more or less based on logic and data structures and algorithms that people develop. Later on, we've developed probabilistic methods, we've developed neural net methods, we've developed a whole bunch of other ways, and we formulate hypotheses. And the way the scientific method works, mostly hypotheses end up being wrong.
Right.
And then you correct them, and you get better ones. That's a kind of evolution of scientific hypotheses.
Right.
But one of the things that people are thinking about is the evolution of human culture. So this is cultural evolution.
Cultural evolution.
And we've talked a little bit about Joe Henrich, who is an anthropologist who has studied cultural evolution.
Yes.
Let me plug his book again, which I know you've enjoyed.
Yes.
The Secret of Our Success.
The Secret of Our Success, Joseph Henrich.
Part of the point that he makes is that human success in the world is not just about humans being smart. You simply aren't smart enough to figure out how to succeed in all the environments that people succeed in. And there's all sorts of dramatic examples of that. But what
Let's give an example.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure if this is from Henrich or if it's from another guy I want to recommend named Nick Christakis,
Okay.
who wrote a book called Blueprint, also about the evolution of successful human cultures. There's some interesting examples that often come, natural experiments that come out of shipwrecks, where people get shipwrecked onto either desert islands or maybe Australia someplace. And people, often these are people from England who come out of Oxford and Cambridge and are therefore the pinnacle of education. And they are so convinced that they are so smart. And they go into these cultures and they know how to do things. And so they carry on and do things their way. And often it simply fails. And they die, get sick and die. One of the examples is these people would see the people in a certain indigenous culture, and they would a lot of their diet consisted of a particular plant, and I don't remember exactly which plant this is, and they would observe the way they would prepare it and cook it and make stuff out of it and do such and such. And in the course of that, one of the things that they would always do when they were cooking it up is they'd take a small handful of the ashes that they used and they'd throw it into the stew. And then they'd keep on going. Our smart explorers said, well, this is obviously stupid. They'd ask the people, why do you do that? Well, I don't know. My mother taught me how to do that. We've always done that. That's what you do. So they said, ridiculous. So they started making it themselves, and they started eating it, and it would fill them up. And they didn't die, at least not immediately. But then they discovered they were getting weaker and more bloated, and then eventually they did die over a period of months.
They needed the charcoal.
They needed the charcoal. What happened is the charcoal neutralized a toxin.
Yeah.
This plant contains a toxin. The charcoal would absorb it, neutralize it, and the local culture had discovered that evolutionarily. The current people in that culture had no memory of why they were doing that. But so they were just doing it because that's what you do. The people who came in had no respect for that. They didn't do it, and evolution takes them away.
This starts to paint the picture of what happens to our evolution if we, in your words, right, have oversimplified models for our AI, right?
Exactly. So evolution is a search algorithm, and it's one of the least efficient search algorithms ever created. Because
I suppose one could argue it's the most efficient, right?
No, you can't.
I mean, compared to what? To human advancements, perhaps.
Compared to other things that you run for billions and billions of years?
Okay. Well, let's compare it to like what? What's a system that's been running for billions of years?
There aren't any others because this is the one you needed.
That's what I'm saying. It's the most efficient.
No, it's not. I mean, we have plenty of search algorithms that you can run for tiny fractions of a second, and we'll find things. But evolution has other attractive properties, and like it can find things that you don't know are there and that you don't know you need. If it turns out you did need it, then if you don't find it, you die and someone else needs it. Someone else finds it.
Right.
So what Joe Henrich concentrated on was the fact that cultures adapted themselves evolutionarily to different parts of the world. And he tells stories about people adapting to the Arctic conditions.
Right.
Where you have to learn how to make clothing that can keep you at livable temperatures, how you can build boats so that you can go out and catch fish, and how you can build spears that can catch those fish, and then how you prepare them and so forth. And each of those takes the culture from an early stage where they may be struggling by on marginal resources, gives them access to more resources, and then they can live better. And that incremental process has taken us over the millennia. Robert Wright, who you've also seen, I particularly enjoyed his book Non-Zero, pointing out that this process, one of the things that this process depends on is cooperating with other people. And there's a lot of things that you just can't do alone.
Right.
And so when you can arrange cooperation with other people, then you can do it. You can accomplish much more than the sum of what the two people could do separately. And so Henrich focused on things like learning to make clothing, make boats, make spears, build pots, do this and that. Wright focused on developing larger and larger civilizations. So you might start out with a band of hunter-gatherers, and then later on you would discover that you could have a chief who would lead and coordinate a larger group of people. And then maybe you would start agriculture.
Right.
Then maybe you would start city-states. And you develop technologies like writing, like money, like counting, eventually the technology of the printing press. The centuries and millennia go by, and maybe you have technologies of electricity and computing.
And eventually AI.
Eventually AI. So
And so now we come to Kuipers and his work on AI's impact on human and cultural evolution.
Well, it's a tool.
It's a tool.
It's a big, fancy tool. We might use it for good. We might use it for ill. Evolution doesn't care. You figure out how to do these things well, and you survive, and you have descendants. You don't figure out how to do it well, and you don't. So in the end, the descendants are doing better.
Okay.
And you may or may not be an ancestor of those descendants, depending on how well you've been able to pull it together.
That's fair.
So let's look at climate change.
Well, before we get to climate change, I have
Okay.
to ask the looming question that everyone has, which is like, in this point in time and up until now, even the era before AI became so popular as it is now, and in 2022 and so on, the fear and the fear mongering that exists, I think, of AI taking over, being able to replace humans. I need your thoughts on this to elaborate. Like, do you believe that AI can replace and become dominant of human society, and that's somewhere that we're going? Or is this a totally unfounded fear?
We've been having this fear for centuries, and we can spin out that fear in compelling ways. I don't tend to worry about it because people like to spin out this notion of making AIs that are the same as humans. And I think whatever AIs end up being, they won't be the same as humans because they are culturally significantly different. When I was in graduate school, I was thinking, suppose we create an AI, a human level intelligence, but it grows up in a box on the 9th floor of Technology Square in Cambridge. That's a different upbringing, even being able to communicate with those things. But of course, we have movies about Skynet or Colossus or various other things that can take over the world. When you look at those things, there's a certain thrust of argument that says they'll become super intelligent. So whatever we do to contain them, they'll be able to break out of that containment. And that because of their super intelligence, they will massacre us all or something. But when you look at the scenarios carefully, it's typically, they're often clever. Skynet was reasonably clever, getting out of a fix it was in, killing billions of people. But it wasn't actually super intelligent. What it was super powerful. So the big mistake
was giving the keys to the nuclear weapons.
Giving the keys to the nuclear weapons. So that's a mistake we got to not make.
Yes.
And if you've watched Dr. Strangelove recently, I'm sure you've seen it before, have you?
I haven't.
Well, it's a gap in your education.
It seems like it, Dr. Strangelove.
So you need to watch Dr. Strangelove. And I mean, this is a spoiler in it, but not much of a spoiler. Someone creates a doomsday device, which is an automated system that if they are attacked with nuclear weapons, then they will respond with a devastating attack that will destroy everybody on Earth. And it's been put in place. It's about to be announced next weekend at a big festival. But this weekend, the American bombers escape from control, and one bomb is dropped, launching this thing and destroying the human race. So don't do that.
Don't do that. So that's the most grandiose version of it, I suppose. It's like the fear, you give it all access to the internet, all that information makes it super intelligent, could take over. But in theory, if it doesn't have the control or the power, it doesn't really matter. The other is in the smaller ways it could be impactful, right? In there being bias in systems, it creating discrimination, it being able to be the reason someone is incorrectly incarcerated or something like that. So what about in those scenarios? Do you see the proliferation of AI too soon being problematic for such, I don't know, such cases?
Well,
or?
I think that there are potential problems here, but I think One of the realizations that I had a while ago was where I'm sitting here worrying about AI based on digital computers. And that's the stuff we work with. We're computer scientists and we build robots. But in fact, the world has largely already been taken over by artificially intelligent creatures, which are corporations.
Right.
They are artificial. They are goal-oriented problem solvers. They control the large majority of the assets of the human race. They are able to make plans and take action in the world.
Right.
And furthermore, at least since the mid-70s and early 80s, they've been largely controlled by an oversimplified model, which says the role of a corporation is to maximize its profits and not to consider ancillary issues of how well this is working with society.
Right.
So I've already mentioned that ethics involves being conscious of what you want, the impact of your actions on society.
Right.
And there's an ideology out there that says corporations shouldn't do that. They are artificially intelligent creatures.
So you
Mitt
place...
Romney says they are people, but that's not true. They include people as components, replaceable components, and they're made of a whole bunch of other stuff that functions a lot like artificial decision makers.
So, and they're powerful, unlike
They are powerful.
unlike much AI that is not given
That's right.
power per se.
So we already face many of these problems.
Right.
And pretty quickly, we're going to get back to climate change
As being one of the most prominent problems.
as being a prominent problem.
Right.
But we also have infectious diseases. We also have nuclear weapons.
Yes.
We have these large entities which take important actions in the world.
What about corporations then building AI? So given much of your work in academia, like I'm curious what your perspective is on these larger companies like OpenAI and Microsoft and kind of the dominance they have per se on maybe on cultural evolution.
Yeah. Well, once upon a time, I was freaking out about corporations and saying, well, we should keep humans in charge of things and eliminate corporations.
Like a monarchy type situation?
That doesn't, yeah, right. I mean, part of the difficulty is what would be the alternative.
What's the alternative? Yeah.
But also I begin to realize, I mean, in my picture of things, cooperation and trust is critical. And so the problem is, how do you make them trustworthy? Because how do you organize corporations so that they are ethical in the same way that we want people to be ethical and we want AIs to be ethical? And we want that to happen because ethics helps create cooperation, and cooperation is what gives us positive sum returns.
So how do we do that?
Lots of little steps.
So if the corporations already come embedded with cooperation, right?
Well, they're doing cooperation.
They're doing cooperation. They exist for cooperation purpose. The next is ethics and trust.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we have to do is recognize that corporations are not the same as people, but they are also participants in our society. And that they have a stake in the survival and thriving of our society. And therefore, they need to follow ethical rules, because ethics is created to encourage the welfare of society and to encourage good behavior on the part of decision makers in order to benefit the society. And so corporations do need to be thinking about those things. We have ways, social pressures. if somebody acts like an asshole all the time, social pressure is applied to that person.
Yes.
And in general, not universally, but a lot of times that gets their attention and teaches them to behave in a more socially congenial way.
We have that here, though, right? You sue a company and you hold them accountable somewhat, or
Somewhat, yes. And there are some companies are more ethical than others. One of the examples I like to give actually is, suppose this gig stops working out and you need a new job. So you go to Walmart and they give you a job as a greeter. And they say, okay, well, we can give you 29 hours a week.
Okay.
Why 29? Because at 30, they have to give you benefits.
right?
So at 29, you're a part-timer and you don't get benefits. So it saves them a chunk of money. Okay, which 29? So they say, okay, we're going to give you a schedule. Every 2 weeks, we're going to give you a schedule that tells you which 29 hours you show up and you do your job. But 2 weeks from now, we're going to give you a new schedule. And we have this 60-hour window in which we will pick 29 hours. And you better be available. So I'm sorry, we're not going to give you more than 29 hours, and we're not going to give you benefits. But if you should get a second job that conflicts with our ability to put those 29 hours anytime we want, well, then you're fired.
It's not very ethical.
Are they going to pay you for those extra 31 hours that they have got an option on? No.
No.
Is it legal? Yes. Is it optimal? Does it optimize their cost-benefit analysis? Yes, sort of.
It does. For the corporation wins,
Yeah.
right? But
So far,
perhaps society doesn't.
Society doesn't.
It's a net bad for society.
So this is part of the positive sum, negative sum. See, sometimes
Let's get into that. Let's explain that. Positive sum, negative sum, game theory.
okay.
Where and at what point did this become interesting to you?
Over the last decade or more, game theory has been out there for a long time. It was created in part inspired by recreational games, and recreational games, by and large, are designed to be zero-sum. That is, what I win, you lose. What you win, I lose. So we have a very clear relationship here.
Yes.
But what von Neumann and Morgenstern, who created game theory, recognized is that it was a much more general framework. And we could actually apply this to lots of interactions. So if you and I cooperate to do something, then we both win.
Symbiotic.
Symbiotic. So, and symbiosis in biology actually can be well described by game theory as well. On the other hand, if you knock me over the head and take my wallet, you gain a little bit, not very much, I can tell you that. But I actually lose significantly more because I've been bonked over the head, for one thing, and I've been traumatized and so forth.
Biology would call this parasitic.
So, yeah, if you think about what makes society work, if most of the interactions in society, if they're just predominantly positive sum, then the society as a whole gets more resources. If they're predominantly negative sum, then they get fewer resources, and the society over time deteriorates. Society's evolution in part depends on its ability to encourage positive sum interactions. If society can encourage us to cooperate in a productive way, then on average society will do much better, even if there's a certain number of people bonking others over the head.
Yes.
But if it's not doing a very good job of that, And you look at cultures around the world where people often talk about rule of law. That's part of the ground rules of cooperation. And in cultures where the rule of law is not highly respected, then many more interactions are negative sum.
In your work, you talk about how cooperation, though, it ebbs and flows at different times in societies, particularly over long periods of times, right? Like centuries.
Yeah.
Where would you say we are right now in the U.S.?
By and large, I mean, I think we're in a pretty cooperative situation.
It's cooperative.
But I think it's a much more heterogeneous thing. So lots of I mean, the ideology that says that corporations have a responsibility to maximize their profits and not to think about the rest of their environment, that is saying that corporations should not be thinking in a cooperative form with individuals. And when you start looking carefully at the impact of economic inequality, one of the things you see are increasing deaths of despair. If you compare the culture nowadays with increasing deaths of despair with the culture, let's say, in the decade or two after World War II, where basically pretty much everybody felt like we as a society were working together,
Right.
and we were going to thrive and succeed together. Now, arguably, that was the United States had come out of World War II in a very privileged position.
Right. So that the level of cooperation that exists then versus now, I mean, I'm curious what you would think it would take perhaps to create a level of cooperation or change among people to where we want to hold these corporations accountable per se, or where we prioritize people over that. And part of me thinks of other countries, and I just culturally, I think of even working in startups, working with other countries like startups in England and Europe, and just how much more laissez-faire it seems their approach is to work, and just the difference in work-life balance. It doesn't feel like the same relationship we have with corporations here. But yeah.
Remember this slogan, move fast and break things?
Yes.
What do you think that means from a cooperative point of view?
Move fast and break things. It probably means take advantage of people.
Yeah. Basically, it says, let's look around and find situations where people are vulnerable, and we'll exploit that. Does that mean you can't make progress? I mean, I don't think so. But, and can you do things that create new value in the world?
Right.
But when you're saying, I'm going to break things, I mean, there are people who are invested in those things that you're breaking.
Right.
And you ought to be thinking about that.
Right.
To some extent. It's also one thing to say when you're a startup in a garage, I'm going to move fast and break things. But when you move out of the garage and you start being one of the dominant industrial players on the planet, you acquire a whole new set of responsibilities. And you can't pretend you live in the garage. Or you shouldn't. And if you do, then very likely you're going to do damage to your entire society. Just like if you bonk me over the head, you come out ahead by a little bit, even though I come out worse by a lot. If you are a large dominant company and you do damage to the society, you may go on getting richer.
Right.
It's just that there's a whole lot of other people who are getting a lot poorer.
Do you see that being a case of change happening too quickly now? Maybe job loss being a big problem? Because someone would argue that it's evolutionary, right? Like it's moving quickly, actually, theoretically, right? Like human evolution, people aren't keeping up actually with the pace of it, and
right. So you're not keeping up so well. I mean, I regret any inconvenience, but you and your family are going to starve to death.
I'm sure that's what the AI corporations will say, right?
Historically, we've had a lot of technological revolutions. Used to be 90% of the working population worked in agriculture. Now it's 2%. So where did those other 88% go? Well, a lot of them went to work in factories, but it also took a generation or two to happen, and so some of those people actually starved.
Wow.
It's not that, I'm sorry, we don't need you on the farm, find something else, and they then truck off down the street and get a job in a mill. Some of them did and some of them didn't. There's a pretty good argument that when agricultural jobs went away, manufacturing jobs were growing. And so, in a sense, the blind hand of Adam Smith helped it all work out. And then, as automation started taking manufacturing jobs, service jobs started being created. And so, again, we could sort of count on the market. Now, as AI starts taking the jobs, you better not graduate in the bottom half of your class from law school these days, right? Because guess where those people's jobs are going? ChatGPT.
Right.
And there's people up and down Silicon Valley working their hearts out, making that happen.
Do you see that as a lack of cooperation of like society and corporate greed, or do you see that as cultural evolution?
Yes. Like I said about evolution being inefficient, I also say that it's extremely expensive, and the expense is in pain and blood and death.
Wow.
Now, here we are.
Is it necessary?
Yes. That's how evolution works,
It has
through
to
death.
it has to happen.
Well,
No, does evolution have to happen?
biological evolution, the fundamental operator in that is death.
Right.
So,
But what about
the pain and
cultural-
blood just often comes along with.
Yeah. And I guess cultural evolution comes along with it as well. But what about, like, I suppose, technological impact
I
on
think we can do those things. Now the question,
without blood and death?
we can do them. We can do those in a more sensible way. But we have to see it as a necessity. So my feeling is, when you look at the graphs of the resources, the productivity, GDP, it's been going up in a fairly consistent linear way since the end of World War II. You look at how much of that is going to the middle class, the working class, and it goes up along that line, following the growth in wealth until about the late 70s, early 80s, and then it goes more or less flat. Interesting, huh? Now that's starting in the 80s. This is not the AI revolution. This is the corporate revolution.
Right.
Where that money is going is to the 1% and the 0.01%. And the people who are tracking the growth in wealth in society are the 90th to 99%. That is upper middle class. Everybody else is losing share of the wealth.
Wow.
Now, I think an important thing to recognize is people need meaningful work. That is, it's not just for the money.
Right.
So I don't think universal basic income, I think it may well be a partial solution, but I don't think it's the full solution, because people need meaningful work.
Right.
And people will do horrible work if it's supporting their family,
Right.
because that gives it meaning.
Yeah.
Now, furthermore, there's whole classes of jobs that, if they are done, will improve the quality of life in our society. And
Dangerous jobs?
actually, an easy set of those are childcare, elder care, health care more generally, environment care. But there's plenty of others. I mean, like, and many of these are ones that that our society supports anyway as being a net good, like public education, defense.
Infrastructure? I don't know, like building
Well,
infrastructure.
infrastructure is often, well, yeah, actually, infrastructure is another good one, and medical research and so forth.
Right.
So there are aspects of our society that we as a society decide to support.
Right.
And I think there are many more of these that we can support that would improve our quality of life. Now, if you do the calculations on childcare, just for example, because there are people out there publishing that kind of stuff, you want to have very well qualified childcare workers. So they need a certain amount of appropriate education in developmental psychology and stuff like that. And so they should be paid commensurate to their qualifications. You want to have a relatively low ratio of, let's say, children to childcare workers. And you want to be able to charge the parents an affordable amount of money. You multiply those things out and they don't work. So what you need to do
Just evolve the tech
is you need to support it.
or support it from.
No, it's not tech.
It's not a make a cheaper solution. It's support it from a society.
Subsidize it.
Subsidize it.
I mean, do you want to subsidize kindergarten teachers?
I mean,
Would you rather subsidize or
probably
would
yes.
you rather technologically? Yes, I think the answer is yes. You want to subsidize
the
kindergarten
teachers,
teachers. Do you want
Probably
to
doctors.
automate that job?
No, I suppose we
No,
don't.
you don't.
We want empathy and we want human.
Right. We need to subsidize jobs. There are a huge range of jobs that would make our lives better. And so we in this room are well paid in various ways. But my life is better if the people in my society
Are well paid.
are well provided for. It isn't true that everybody has to be paid the same by a long shot, but everybody has to be secure, and you have to have people doing meaningful things.
Yes.
So we can create those jobs, but it won't happen because of the blind hand of Adam Smith. It'll happen if we can make that a matter of will. We have to decide to do it.